Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be applying the sociological theories to race and ethnicity. We're also going to be talking about the history and social construction of race. First, we need a basic understanding of the difference between race and ethnicity. When we're talking about race, we're talking about biological traits. This does include things like skin, but more specifically things like our DNA. And then the difference between race and ethnicity is race is biology and ethnicity is cultural. Cultural meaning a common way of life, people that share a common language, common traditions, common ideologies. So again, the difference between race and ethnicity. Race is biology, ethnicity, we're talking about cultural differences. When it comes to categorizing races, what you're going to find is races tend to be a blend of not only physical factors, things that we arbitrarily assume people share in common, but also things like geographic location, which is an aspect of culture, or, regions that share similar ways of life. So when we go to apply the theories, again, it's good to have a basic understanding of the sociological theories, and then we can apply those to race and ethnicity. So functionalist theory basically says that all institutions contribute to the functioning of the whole. This means things like the education system, the family, the economy, the government, they all serve a purpose. And then, once they've been institutionalized, they then structure our life. We have to follow the rules of the government, we're required to go to school, we need money, therefore we're, structured by the type of economy that we live in to be able to get resources to feed ourselves and people that we care about. But what's kind of confusing is that these institutions don't require being physical. Like the education system is both buildings, but it's also an ideology behind it, for example. So just because something is institutionalized, it can also be an idea. So the idea can become an institution, which then structures our life. Things like religion, views on religion, then historically structure the lives of many people, and they continue to today. Well, race is the same thing. The idea is that the institution of race was created for a purpose. But when you ask what's the purpose of creating race, then you start to realize that race came about, the idea that people are actually black, white, Asian, Native American, this came about when Europeans wanted to dominate the global economy. So during the age of colonialism and the introduction to colonialism, there was no such thing as white and black. These idea of races didn't exist. There were countries, like they were from England or they were from, Africa, an entire continent, for an example. But the idea of race as we know it today did not exist. Races were created so that Europeans could stratify, divide society into social classes, the upper class and the lower classes, the purpose of which was so that Europeans could dominate an upper class social position. So Europeans already didn't have to compete with females because females were restricted from participating economically and socially in many, many areas. So that already 50% of the competition was removed for Europeans. But then by creating racial categories, Europeans first started out with European became white and all other races became non-white. And so Europeans were like, okay, if you're white, you get to get a job and have a chance to compete, while anybody that is non-white, non-European, you're going to be excluded from being able to participate. So not only were women restricted, but then all non-Europeans were restricted, and all of those groups became minority groups that became stuck in the lower classes. And remember, females are the most oppressed group of all in human history, followed by other racial and cultural minorities. So again, race comes about for economic purposes. The purpose of institutionalizing race was so that Europeans could divide society into upper class and lower classes, into a class system from which Europeans could dominate the upper classes and subjugate all other minorities into the lower classes. Okay, so that's the purpose. That's the initial function of race. According to conflict theory, which says that groups compete with groups for precious resources. Again, the Europeans constructed racial categories so that they could reduce competition for precious resources. Europeans were able to maintain an elite upper-class social position in the stratified social hierarchy that we live in for hundreds of years by subjugating minorities, women and racial and ethnic minorities, into the lower classes. This caused a ton of conflict because it created a lot of inequality between the bourgeoisie, the European males, and the proletariat, the non-European males and females. Okay? So the inequality that resulted from racial conflict comes about when people were coming together and developing a class consciousness and making a decision to change the dynamics between social classes, meaning to combat the oppressor. So you had generations of people that fought for women's rights, for racial rights, for ethnic rights. These culminated in the reduction of the ending of slavery. I mean, again, beginning is a very gradual process. Like England reduced slavery and then got rid of slavery, and then the United States followed thereafter. So there's a beginning oppression, even though in something we fought a civil war with in the United States was the ending of slavery. And then after the ending of slavery, it became more about equality and equity. How do you enable minority groups like African Americans and Asians and females to be able to rise up the social class ladder to be able to compete? And this took generations of social movements culminating in the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement itself did not end racism, but it reduced racism, and there was an attitude shift toward a more equitable society and a reduction in intolerance overall following the civil rights movement. But again, the reason we had things like the Black Lives Movement or the women's movement that's going on now to end sexual violence and discrimination and harassment in the workplace, again, this is continuing because sexism and racism and ethnocentrism still exist. Okay, so there is still a lot of racial conflict in society, but again, the origin of that conflict is the subjugation of groups and then the reduction of equity and inclusion between groups, okay? Symbolic interactionism is a theory that says that society is constructed through social interaction, that individuals using language, symbols to communicate with each other work together to build society, not just the physical aspects of society, but also the ideological bases for society. So race came about when Europeans came together and used words to come up with this idea that people are actually different genetically, biologically, based upon their color of their skin, for the example, or their nation of origin. Now, remember that race comes about in around the 1700s. Prior to that, there were no such thing as racial groups. And again, back then, they didn't have DNA testing and genetic testing to be able to really figure out if there's actually any accurate, if their racial categories that they were coming up with were actually accurately coding people according to common genes. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, they were completely false, and the idea that all African Americans, for example, share common genes is completely false. The idea actually is that someone who is white in America has more genetically in common with someone in Africa, which might not make sense than their white next door neighbor, because genetics are kind of counterintuitive. You need more diversity within a group than you do between a group. Therefore, people that live close to each other need more diversity than people that live far away from each other to avoid some of the physical impairments that can result from sharing too many common genes. So symbolic interactionism says that humans created race. Race does not exist in nature. Race was created so that Europeans could dominate society and clearly dictate who gets to belong to what group. Okay, and so there is no biological basis for race. Race is socially constructed. It's something we made up, just like ghosts or Santa Claus. But people think race is a permanent structure of society because it's been around for a few hundred years. And I'm saying, well, most people don't really ever question their race and really ask questions like, am I white? Am I black? Am I Asian? I'm from India. Why am I Asian? Do I look like someone who's from China? Do I look like someone who's from Russia, considering pretty much all of Russia is in Asia? And then people think that Europe is a separate continent. But guys, Europe is part of Asia. Europe is not a separate continent. Europe and Asia are the same continent. So why aren't, Europeans Asians, for example? Why do they get to be white? And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in the class, questions like that, but things to think about. So again, the idea of race is a misnomer. People think that races have biological traits in common and things, but that's not how genetics work. I often joke about the Norwegian blacks because people from Norway to Africa share common genetics for resistance to malaria and fingerprints. People from Western Europe and Western and North Africa also are a race, arguably, because they share, things like the ability to drink milk, which people in West Africa and, in Asia have a little bit more lactose intolerance, for example. So how we actually code people according to common genetics is something we really need to be questioning. But in America, we have a racial system that consists of 4 races in another category. And so basically we have white, Asian, black or African, and then Native American, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, or other. And so it's a little bit confusing because there's an incredible amount of genetic diversity, yet we only use 4 racial categories in an other to be able to code people. So again, the categories themselves do not accurately group people according to biological differences. And again, for example, if you were to look at race according to genetic similarities for things like heart disease, people from Asia to Europe to Africa to North America to Latin America share common genes for heart disease. So those people that share those common genes essentially could be coded as a race. The medical community themselves are basically saying that race should not ever be used in medical research because it makes no sense when you actually account for racial data, because the categories that we use to account for genetics that are common do not at all make any sense to biological doctors that are actually studying the way that genes work. So the medical community is saying, please stop using words like white and black because it's messing up all the data. So again, the origin of race, as we talked about, is economics. Europeans, socially constructed, came up with these racial categories together to divide society into social classes, those that could have the bourgeoisie and those that could not, the proletariat. And the whole goal was European domination and to reduce competition, because we live in a capitalist society. Okay, in a capitalist society, the goal is to reduce competition. So racial categories were constructed in such a way that Europeans got to be called white, and then other groups such as the Irish and people that are Jewish and people from Eastern Europe and the Middle East and parts of North Africa were able to become white too, and same with the Russians. Africans became black or African. People from India to Asia to Mongolia became Asian, and then Native Americans and Latin Americans and Pacific Islanders start to have this incredible blend. So our racial category construction were created so that we could have these interesting disparities between which race could have it and which one couldn't. For example, in America, we have racial categories, but in Latin America, we have something called the color gradient. So in Latin America, based upon how light your skin you are, that dictates your ability to access rising up the social class ladder by gaining socioeconomic status. So historically in Latin America, after Spain was overthrown, people that were European descendants born in America got to be the upper class. People that were European mixed with Native American, which is called mestizo, which most Americans that think they're white actually are mestizos because of the blend of the Native American, they got to have some power in some jobs. People that were European mixed with African, which is called mulatto in Latin America, they were able to have a little bit less good of jobs than people that were mestizos, the Europeans mixed with Latin Americans. And then you have your completely Native Americans that were now called Amerindians, is one way of racially categorizing people that have mostly Native American in their blood, for example. They were able to have a little bit less than people that were European mixed with African. And then below that, you had your African slaves. And so the color gradient in Latin America still continues to this day because people with the lighter colored skin tend to have more power over their lives, life chances, more access to property and resources than people with darker colored skin, for example. So the racial diversity in Latin America is very, very complex. Their categories are very blended depending upon how much of what you have of each country of origin, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And so the racial diversity in America in modern times is around 60% European descended or white. You have around 10 to 12% that are African or African American, around 7% that are Asian, 5% Native American. Okay, so again, we have to be questioning all kinds of things. Where did race come from? Why was it created in the first place? Who created race? How did they construct race? How was an entire society built upon racist principles that even excluded people from the Constitution that were female or non-white? Okay, what was the purpose of constructing race? Questioning the actual racial categories themselves and whether or not they actually accurately code people according to biological traits. And then really examining the diversity of our genetics themselves and really asking questions. Like, do our racial categories code people according to actual racial diversity? And what I'm saying is, and what the research is saying is, if you were to actually code people according to biological traits, true races, you would need hundreds of races, possibly thousands of races, to really consider all of the genetic variability that there are. And this idea of genetic variability and the categories themselves can be questioned across the board. For example, how many sexes are there? It used to be 2, male and female. Then it was 3, male, female, and intersex. But then if you subdivide the variations of male, female, and intersex and the potential genetic mutations associated with that, there are hundreds of possible sexes. So again, we should be constantly questioning these things. Okay, so the history of race relations in the U.S. Again, during the age of colonialism, Europeans wanted to dominate the world, so therefore they came up with racial categories and subjugated everybody into the lower classes. The most subjugated were the ones who were slaves, and above that was indentured servitude. Again, England ended slavery in the early 1800s, and America during the Civil War. I'm not saying that Civil Wars necessarily started over slavery, but it became a huge factor. And then when Lincoln won in Antietam, that was the moment where he was finally able to announce the Emancipation Proclamation because they needed a win. So slavery does get ended. But as a result of slavery being ended and Lincoln being assassinated in the failed Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws get imposed. So this is when you begin the area of segregation. So even though slavery was ended, still the restrictions socially and economically against minorities did not end. I mean, women still were not allowed to work. Minority races and ethnicities still were not allowed to become president and senator and become, the bosses of large corporations because they didn't have access to capital to even begin those corporations, During the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, Native Americans were completely almost wiped out. 95% of them died through guns, germs, and disease, And the rest of the Native Americans, through time and through treaties and policies of the United States, were forced onto reservations, and these reservations were not in areas where they had good land. So again, Europeans came in, colonized. You can say it's warfare. You could say the British and the Spanish won for a while. You can also, sorry, the lights in this room. You could also say that it was genocide, and depending upon your perspective of the colonization periods and the different types of warfare and impositions of cultures and putting in societies that reap the economic welfare of these countries, including the people that live there, you can call it genocide. So again, it's really just a debate. Like, did England commit genocide when all the Native Americans died, or did the Native Americans just lose the war? And so again, it's this back and forth that how do we judge history? Do we judge history? How far back in history should we go back and judge? All of these questions need to be asked. We have since apologized again for slavery. We've apologized as Congress has apologized for the Native Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, when prejudice and discrimination against Asian people became so extreme for other reasons, all social reasons, but also because people had this fear that immigrants were going to take their jobs, which is not how it works. Again, immigration increases the gross national product. It increases the amount of tax money going into the system. It enables people that live in America to get better jobs because they have to become the managers of the people that are immigrating and taking the lower class jobs. Again, immigration does nothing but improve the economy of a country. But still, we had prejudice and discrimination against Asians, specifically the Chinese at that time, so they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. When this happened, people that were already living here, that were already American citizens, their citizenship was literally stripped away. The United States just took away people's citizenship, which is one of the major racial atrocities of our history that doesn't get as much mention as things like slavery or the Native American potential genocide. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, this also got extended to not only Chinese people, but pretty much all people from Asia, including people from India, from Mongolia, from Japan, so across the board. Okay, the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't repealed until the very late 1930s because anti-Asian sentiment lasted for several decades, almost 50 years. And then World War II happened. One reason for World War II is racism themselves. See, again, Japan, this is one reason for the Japanese involvement in World War II, but Japan helped the United States defeat Germany in World War I. And then Japan thought that we would stop being racist against Asians and allow Japanese people to come into their country and then have just some general respect for them as a country. And instead, the Americans continued the racist policies, refused to let people from Japan into the country, and considered to think of them as a second-rate country. And so Japan was very upset about this. And they were upset about the racist policies, and they were upset about racism in general, and the idea that Americans thought they were superior to people from Asia and Japan. So that is one reason that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, for example, is racism. That this doesn't get a lot of attention because we always just want to vilify everybody. But it was America's racist policies. That was one reason that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, for example. Okay? So the Chinese Exclusion Act lasted until the 1950s, and then anti-Asian sentiment around the 1960s became a lot better, and you started to see our immigration policies improve toward Asians at this time and Latin Americans. The takeover of Hawaii, the U.S. Congress apologized for the takeover of Hawaii. We went into Hawaii and we took away their king, and we made it part of the United States without asking. We then since apologized for that also. Again, this is just part of the U.S. imperialism, where after we overthrew England and then kind of established ourselves, then we began on our own imperialism policy. Okay? So immigration patterns, initially you had lots of different groups coming over, but then it became primarily people from Africa and from Europe. And then in the 1800s, you start to see people from China start to come over and other people from Asia. And then again, after that, we started to have a lot of Eastern Europeans. When we introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act, we wouldn't let anybody that was Asian come over. And then we had some anti-European policies, so then we started to go, and then around the 1960s, we decided in the end that we were going to become a better people, and our kind of racist immigration policies got a lot better, and we started to let people come across all over. Okay? In general, U.S. has had pro and then negative immigration policies toward pretty much every group. Again, we've talked about the Native Americans. They were already here. That was more like genocide. We brought the Africans over as slavery. There was a lot of prejudice against them. We had Europeans coming over. For example, the Irish were considered an inferior race. So like England forever thought that Ireland was an actual different race than the English, even though they literally are like on the same island. But whatever. So the Irish were treated as an inferior race, but eventually they got a lot of numbers and started to gain political power, and the anti-Irish sentiment started to go away. Anti-Eastern European sentiment started to come away when people started coming over in droves from Italy and Greece and all over the Baltics. You had, anti-Latin American sentiment that's still going on to this day that kind of comes and goes in waves depending. But again, all of this is just prejudice and discrimination that's socially constructed. Immigration does nothing but improve the country, yet we continuously have these anti-immigration, anti-specific group sentiments. Okay, and it's just incredibly sad that it still continues and people that are just uninformed about this kind of stuff. Colorblind racism is the belief that racism has gone away, that racism no longer exists, and the problem with colorblind racism is that racism still exists. Again, somebody with a white-sounding name gets government assistance 8 times more than somebody with a black-sounding name. Same thing with getting hired. Same thing with trying to get a mortgage. African Americans and Asians are continuously being discriminated against when they try to get a mortgage because they don't have a white-sounding name and they don't look white, for example. And that's completely ridiculous. And you see it all the time in the news. So the idea that racism is gone because civil rights was passed is not true. Now you have this covert, institutionalized racism where really it's a hiring manager in an office. And this happens against women too. For example, men are promoted 2 times to every 1 woman. And again, that's because of prejudice and discrimination. Therefore, because racism, sexism, heterosexism, ethnocentrism, all these isms still exist against minorities groups, you have this continued rise of social movements that are just nonstop. Women's rights movements and, non-heterosexual rights movements and, racial rights movements like the Black Lives Matter, the movement that we just had. Hate crimes continue to exist. This year and last year was the highest time ever for hate crimes. There were almost 3,000 against African Americans, 300 against Asian Americans, an incredible amount against Jewish Americans. It just does not stop in America. But all this hate crime comes from socialized prejudice and discrimination. So again, if we just stopped being prejudicial, if we became a country of tolerance where we accepted diversity and inclusion, a lot of this would go away. The hate crimes would go away. Racism is a global issue. It's not just in America, but every region has its own type of racism. Because in Africa, they don't have words like black. Do not call someone black if they're from Africa. Africans don't even think they're black until they come to America and they're told they're black because that doesn't exist where they're from, for example. In Latin America, you have the color gradient. Again, in Asia, racism is not really a racism. It's more like ethnicity-cism, ethnocentrism, sorry, just a fun word to play around with. But ethnocentrism, where Hindus think they're better than a Muslim, and a Hindu thinks a Muslim's inferior. And so again, we should be questioning all of these negative prejudices that exist in the world. And again, ethnocentrism is defined as judging one's culture based upon your own instead of cultural relativism, which is judging a culture based upon their culture. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.